This is Max from UNFTR for the Midas Touch Network, and today we're talking about GDP. Fun alert! The administration and financial news channels are taking a victory lap over the recently released GDP report that shows that third quarter U.S. GDP increased at an annual rate of a whopping 4.3%. Now, anyone just choosing to accept this report as a positive signal will probably view what I'm about to break down as evidence of me suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. You know, it's difficult sometimes to be less sanguine about these reports than the mainstream or just outright negative because it almost feels like I'm starting to root against America or that I'm being selectively negative. But when you actually dig into the report, it unearths some really ugly realities that have to be addressed. So let me offer this disclaimer before I rip this thing to shreds. GDP doesn't measure the health of the economy or the population, and we were trending in the wrong direction long before Trump. My critique is that this version of Trump, meaning Trump 2.0, is exacerbating the issues that are facing the middle and lower classes. And these reports really only distort reality. So if you're down for a reality check and you want to really unpack these, then hang in with me. If you'd prefer to just ignore it and look away because, it's the holidays, I feel you.
Make it a habit. A 10-minute AI routine every morning. You'll be unrecognizable by Christmas. You in?
So this is how I became the most dangerous person in the room. One habit changed everything. I replaced social media with microlearning. Now, instead of wasting time on social media, I spend 15
We're looking for 3.3. Zoom, zoom, zoom. 4.3%.
Okay, let's start with some fundamentals because if we're going to dissect the report, we need to understand what we're actually measuring. GDP, or gross domestic product, is essentially the total value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's borders during a specific time period. So think of it as the grand total of everything the economy produces. From the iPhone in your pocket to the haircut you got last week to the fighter jet that the military just purchased. And GDP has four main components, and each one tells us a very different story about economic activity. So first up, we have consumer spending. This is personal consumption expenditures, or PCE. This is the big guy. This represents about 68% of GDP, and it includes everything that households buy. Cars, groceries, services like healthcare, those haircuts, and dining out. Then we have investment, and this isn't your stock portfolio. In GDP accounting, investment means business spending on equipment, structures, software, R&D, but also residential construction, so there's a consumer element to it as well. It includes changes in business inventories. So when businesses see opportunity and have access to affordable capital, they invest. When they're uncertain about the future, they sit on their cash. Next up, we have government spending. Federal, state, local, all of it. Government purchases of goods and services, and this includes everything from teacher salaries to defense contracts to just paving the roads. Now, the primary driver here is fiscal policy. It's what governments choose to spend money on and how much they're willing to borrow to do it. And then lastly, we have net exports. So exports minus imports. When we sell more to the world than we buy from it, it adds to GDP. When we import more than we export, it subtracts. So the drivers here are exchange rates, relative prices, trade policies, tariffs, and the strength of the other economies we're dealing with. So here's the thing that usually trips people up. GDP growth doesn't tell you anything about distribution. It doesn't tell you who's actually benefiting. GDP measures the size of the pie, not how it's sliced. So keep that in mind as we go forward. So before we dive into the components of this seemingly stellar quarterly growth rate, let's put the number in context by looking at how the US performed relative to our peer nations in the OECD. So the OECD just released their estimates for Q3, and the United States does look like the star student in the class. The overall OECD area saw quarter-on-quarter real GDP growth of just 0.2%. which was down from 0.4% in the second quarter. Year over year, OECD GDP growth, mouthful, slowed from 1.5% from 1.7% the previous quarter. So, by comparison, our growth is about 1.1% quarter-on-quarter growth is very robust. But let's really dig into the numbers here. The US was 0.7% better quarter over quarter. France, 0.5%, which is actually pretty good. Germany was flat, but they're stable because they had contracted in the second quarter. Italy squeaked out 0.1%. The UK was somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2%, which was down from the previous quarter. Canada rebounded with a 0.6% after a nasty contraction of negative 0.5 in Q2 because the US and tariffs and fighting and all that kind of nonsense. But I guess when you have a central banker at the head of your economy instead of a nut job, things work out pretty well. And then we have Japan. So Japan contracted by 0.6% in the third quarter. Now, Japan's economy deserves its own deep dive. It's very, very, let's say, intertwined with us, and the financial markets play a huge role. And we're going to do a subsequent video to explain what's happening there and how it has massive implications for the global economy, but mostly for us. For today, just know that Japan is in trouble right now. So the one outlier among all these major OECD economies was South Korea, which posted a strong 1.3% quarter-over-quarter growth. So Korea has been investing heavily in semiconductors, EVs, advanced manufacturing, and it seems to be paying off, at least in terms of GDP. So relative to most of our partners, the US appears to be performing well. We're ahead of Europe, we're way ahead of Japan, we're competitive with Korea, but here's where we have to pump the brakes on the celebration. The question isn't, are we performing better than Germany? The question is, who's it benefiting? What's driving the growth? Is it sustainable? Because as we're about to see, the composition of the growth tells a very different story than the headline suggests. Okay, so let's actually break down the four main components and we'll look at the growth drivers specifically. So here's the overview. Overall consumer spending was up. Exports were up and government spending was up, but investments were down. Now, taken together, when you add up all of these moving pieces using the BEA's methodology, we get to the 4.3% annualized figure. So let's talk about it component by component.
This is the reason why I've canceled my internet service provider subscription. This brand new portable Wi-Fi router provides more features.
Consumer spending contributed 2.4 of the 4.3% GDP growth, so by far the largest contributor, in fact over half. Within consumer spending, we have to look at both goods and services though, because they tell slightly different stories. So we'll start with goods. Durable goods are things that last more than 3 years, like cars, appliances, electronics, right? That contributed 0.12%. But here's what's interesting. Within durable goods, when you drill down, the increase was led by recreational goods and vehicles. So your brain might automatically go to RVs and boats and jet skis like mine, but that's not the story. Again, you got to drill down into it. The report specifically states that the increase in recreational goods and vehicles primarily reflected an increase in information processing equipment. So we're talking about computers, tablets, laptops, high-end electronics. So this is not your average American just buying the first computer for their kids. This is higher income households upgrading their tech. Motor vehicles and parts actually subtracted 0.17%. So regular people weren't buying new cars and buying new equipment for their cars. Food and beverage added 0.1 percentage points, and we'll come back to why that matters in a minute. So let's talk about the services side, which contributed 1.7%. The leading contributors were healthcare, overwhelming, which added 0.76% of that. So again, half, a little bit more. So, and there were other services that added 0.4 percentage points. So within the other services, let's talk about that before healthcare, the big movers were international travel and professional services like legal services. So let me translate the whole thing on the services side. Healthcare spending is going up. Now, is that because we're healthier? No. It's because healthcare is more expensive and our population is aging. So this is just going to keep going up. Also, now this is speculation, but I'll consider it informed speculation. You have to wonder how many people are front-loading medical procedures and appointments while they still have insurance that they can afford, especially with all the uncertainty around healthcare policy. So recreation services added 0.17%. So food services and accommodations, which is dining out in hotels, contributed 0.06%. Financial services and insurance added 0.14%. So you might as well pass the Grey Poupon to everyone that's responsible for these categories. And here's the TLDR on consumer spending. The growth is concentrated in specific categories that primarily benefit from spending from higher income households. Tech purchases, dining out, recreation, travel. These are not the spending patterns of a broad-based economic recovery. These are the spending patterns of the top 10% of income earners who are doing just fine. Food spending was up a little, but we know that that's driven by food inflation, not by people buying more food. In fact, we know from reports throughout the year that we've covered here on Midas, people are buying less food. They just have to pay more for it. So they're paying more for the same groceries or less. Housing and utilities contributed 0.03 percentage points, which was basically flat. Transportation added 0.0 percentage. These are not robust categories. So the categories that regular working families depend on were all flat or down.
This mine threatens wolves, Canada lynx, northern long-eared bats, and the drinking water that millions.
Now let's talk about trade, because this is where the Trump administration is going to claim some victory. And we'll start with the definition. Exports are goods and services that we produce domestically and sell to foreign buyers. Imports are goods and services that are produced abroad and purchased by domestic buyers. So both include tangible goods like cars and machinery and auto parts and soybeans. And then we also have services like tourism and financial services and consulting. But in GDP accounting, exports add to growth because they represent domestic production, and imports subtract from GDP, not because imports are bad, but because they represent spending on foreign production rather than domestic production. So when imports decrease, that's actually a positive contribution to GDP growth. Now, generally speaking, having negative net exports, meaning importing more than you send out, is actually normal for a consumption-driven economy like the United States, because we are the world's consumer. But a big import bill can also mean that your domestic manufacturing and services sector isn't competitive enough to meet domestic demand, so you're sourcing from abroad. Okay, so with that, let's actually look at the numbers, because exports contributed 0.9% to GDP growth, and that's actually pretty significant. Imports, on the other hand, decreased, which in turn contributed 0.67% to GDP, because remember, decreased imports add mathematically because we're buying less foreign production. So the Trump administration is going to look at this and say, see, our tough tariff policies are working. But let's, again, drill into this. Imports are down, yes, but they're down primarily because of what economists call tariff front-running earlier in 2025. So businesses who were anticipating these tariffs pulled forward their imports in late 2024 and early 2025. They stockpiled inventory. So now in Q3, imports naturally declined because businesses already had the inventory they need. This isn't a sign of domestic manufacturing resurgence. In fact, we know from the labor figures that manufacturing is in a significant decline. No, this is a sign of businesses gaming the tariff timeline. And we already see this in the data. The report notes that the decrease in investment is primarily reflective of a decrease in private inventory investment. So businesses are drawing down on the inventories that they built up this year. Remember, this is looking back at Q3. So we're in Q4 right now, so we have no idea what this looks like. But this all kind of makes sense if you line up the timing. So this is a temporary fluctuation, not a structural change. Now, Exports are up. Goods increased, led by capital goods and non-durable consumer goods. Services also increased, which was led by business services and professional and management consulting. Now, here again, the Trump administration will point to this and claim that their trade negotiations are working, but there's a far simpler explanation, and it's one that actually hurts American consumers. And I know you got to be thinking this is Trump derangement syndrome, but this is just how economics works. It's because the dollar has been devalued, which is something that Trump needed in order to goose exports, by the way. So this all correlates to his plan, but here's the data. The dollar is down 6.4% year over year, and it's off 8% from its high in 2025. So when the dollar weakens, our goods and services become cheaper for foreign buyers. So yes, exports are up, but imports become more expensive for American consumers, i.e. inflation.
I can't imagine what it would be like to have to suddenly leave my home, where to take my family, how to survive, and most importantly, who will help us? Well, the answer is the International Rescue Committee. This wonderful organization was Albert Einstein's genius idea. They focus on the world's toughest places, Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, and deliver food and shelter, medical.
Okay, so government spending, consumption figures by the government increased, and it's a pretty cut and dry story except for one eye-popping number. So overall, it was up 0.39 percentage points. That's what it added to GDP. So federal government spending contributed 0.19%, but it was driven almost exclusively by military spending. So here's the eye-popping number. National defense spending increased 5.8% in third quarter. And that's how it contributed to just that marginal increase overall. Now, increased defense spending doesn't help the average American household. It doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't lower healthcare costs. It doesn't improve infrastructure. It's government spending, so it counts towards GDP, but from a consumer welfare perspective, it's meaningless to most families. But it can blow the shit out of a small fishing vessel in the Caribbean. Non-defense federal spending actually declined 1.1% in third quarter. So we're cutting non-defense discretionary spending while we're ramping up defense spending. That's a policy choice, but it shows up as in GDP as growth. Again, it doesn't improve anybody's life, but it's growth, right? Now, state and local government spending contributed 0.2%. This includes things like salaries and benefits for teachers, police, firefighters, school supplies, utilities, routine maintenance, and the services themselves like education and public safety. So why is state and local government spending up? Is it because state and local governments suddenly have more money to spend on public services? No. It's because federal funding and support has decreased, and state and local governments are filling the gaps themselves. So this is just budget shuffling. The federal government cuts for things like infrastructure grants and education support and healthcare programs, that's affecting state and local budgets because they have to pick up the slack by either raising revenues, which means higher taxes, or cutting services. So from the consumer's perspective, again, this is at best a net neutral and possibly negative because state and local taxes tend to be more regressive than federal taxes. Lastly, we get to investment. And this is where the story gets really interesting and also troubling. Overall gross domestic spending subtracted 0.02 percentage points from GDP growth. It actually decreased 0.3% at an annual rate after declining 13.8% the previous quarter. But within investment, we have to separate these components. Again, we got to drill down because they're telling different stories. So you got fixed investments, which are investments into long-term assets, which contributed 0.19 percentage points, which increased 1%. But private inventory investments subtracted 0.2 percentage points. Remember what we discussed about front-running tariffs? Businesses built up inventories earlier in anticipation of tariffs, and now they're driving them down. This is why private inventory investment decreased, which was led by wholesale trade and manufacturing. So if we look at fixed investment more closely, this is where the AI infrastructure story comes in. Residential investment, housing, actually contracted. It decreased 5.1%, after declining 5.1% the previous quarter as well. Housing investment has been negative or flat for multiple quarters, so we're not building homes, right? The American dream of home ownership is increasingly out of reach, and the GDP data confirms it. Non-residential structures, that's commercial real estate, also declined 6.3%. I'm sensing a trend. Transportation equipment, also down. So what's driving the investment? Two things: information processing equipment and intellectual property products. Basically, the investment into AI infrastructure is driving the investment component of GDP growth. Think about how much those other pieces were down, and for the whole picture to be a little bit positive means the investment into this AI infrastructure is enormous. So this is the spending from the hyperscalers, right? Google, Meta, Amazon, Oracle, and Microsoft. Every leading financial analyst has reached consensus on one point: that the bulk of investment spending overall is into the AI infrastructure. Everything else is declining. And we can see it in the data centers being built, the NVIDIA revenue numbers, the capital expenditure guidance from the hyperscalers. So it leads to a couple of questions. Does this investment benefit the average worker? Does it create good paying jobs? Does it improve living standards? The answer is a Sophie's Choice answer. See, if it doesn't succeed, then all these GDP gains are phantom gains. And if it does ultimately succeed, it's actually designed to eliminate a quarter of the workforce. So I try to boil things down to the simplest thing. And in my opinion, the whole GDP argument, which is driven by consumer spending, boils down to one chart. This is household credit card debt, and it is continuing to explode. So if you're wondering how consumer spending can be growing when real wages for most workers are stagnant or declining, this is your answer. It's debt. Those high-end purchases driving durable goods spending, financed with credit. Those dining out experiences and recreation expenditures, credit cards. Or maybe not, because maybe on the luxury end, they're just paying cash. But day-to-day purchases like groceries and basic necessities and healthcare and all that stuff, it's going on the plastic because people are struggling to make ends meet. The credit card debt explosion is a direct, unambiguous evidence of the K-shaped economy that we're living in. The top 10 to 20% of income earners are doing great, spending freely, driving GDP growth, but the bottom 80 to 90 are increasingly underwater, turning to high-interest credit cards to maintain their standard of living or just to afford basic necessities. And here's what makes this so pernicious. Credit card spending shows up in the GDP data as consumer spending growth, which looks like economic health, but it's not health, it's desperation. It's people borrowing at 20 to 25% interest rates to buy groceries and pay their rent because their wages haven't kept pace with inflation. So now let's bring this all together. GDP grew at 4.3% in the third quarter of 2025. That's the headline, right? That's what the Trump administration is celebrating. That's what the financial news channels are calling a win. But when you dig into the components, this is what you find. Consumer spending growth is driven by high-end discretionary purchases by affluent households. Increased healthcare spending because healthcare is more expensive and people are scared of losing coverage. And higher food spending because food prices have gone up, not because people are getting or eating better. Export growth is driven primarily by a weaker dollar, which makes U.S. goods cheaper for foreigners and bringing in foreign tourists, while that same weak dollar makes imports more expensive for American consumers. Government spending growth driven by increased defense expenditures that don't benefit us, with state and local governments having to raise taxes and fill gaps from reduced federal funding. Investment growth is driven almost entirely by AI infrastructure, by a handful of tech giants. Investment in technology designed to eliminate our jobs, while residential investment is negative. We're not building the homes that people need. And underlying the consumer spending is an explosion of credit card debt as people borrow at usurious interest rates just to maintain their standard of living. GDP doesn't measure economic health. GDP doesn't measure human welfare. GDP measures economic activity. And economic activity can look robust even as the majority of the population falls further behind. So it's not you. The economy really is broken. It's broken in ways that show up as growth. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at UNFTR. And don't forget to visit our website at unftr.com, where you can browse our directory of progressive resources, original articles, podcast archive, and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. As always, thank you to the Meidas Mighty for having me, and I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily